So, as I was saying before I was mic'd up, these are lift sunglasses. And you think about it, all these different industries are being completely disrupted by technology. You know, we've got Lyft and Uber disrupting the taxi industry. We've got Amazon disrupting book sell stores. We've got Netflix that's taking down TV as we know it. And now we have our mobile phones that can handle these devices that take things like heart rate variability, EEG, or any of these other measures that we can deliver to patients. And I think the next thing that's going to be disrupted is the healthcare industry. For those of you who haven't seen the Muse app, I did have a little video here that I was playing before we hooked up the other laptop. But just for those of you that haven't seen the app from Muse, that's how you connect with the settings. And this music actually isn't on the app. This is from one of my YouTube videos. But you start the session. It calibrates. Those multicolored circles tell you if it's connected to your skin properly so that it's actually getting the good EEG signal.
Take a deep breath. As you exhale, let go of any tension you might be holding in your face and jaw. Muse is now listening to your brain signals. Relax and let your mind.
So what it's doing right there is calibrating. It's setting a baseline of where your brain is at so that it can take you into deeper meditative states throughout the session.
There's no need to do anything about it. Ready? Place your attention on your breath now.
It takes you through this meditative experience. You're going to hear waves and sound if your brain is getting distracted. And as you bring it back to the breath, what's supposed to happen is you hear birds. It gets quieter, you hear birds, and you're in this serene environment, but it's a bit of a challenge because as soon as the birds come, you get all excited and say, oh, the birds are here, and then they fly off. So the idea is training your mind to be focused on the breath. And I think the strength of this program is really introducing people to meditation and allowing providers to get people to build that habit of meditating and building their mindfulness practice. I'll just fast forward to, this is the screen. I actually did this meditation session this morning, so yay me. But this is what you'll see in terms of the data feedback. And I'll just switch over to my presentation. And so my name's Cody Rall. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm still active duty Navy. I just finished training at Walter Reed Hospital, which was like such a interesting environment. We had National Institute of Health across the street. There was a research center right there on campus called the National Intrepid Center of Excellence that focused specifically on traumatic brain injury and PTSD. There's a lot of people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts with head injuries. And they had cutting-edge technology there, like magnetic encephalography, fMRI machines, you name it, it was there. And it really stirred my interest in the connection between technology and the mind. And during that time, I decided to start a YouTube channel in which I would talk about different technologies that were being developed to take a look at neuroscience and interfacing with the mind. One of the videos that I put out somewhere around October 2015 was taking a look at these EEG devices that were out. There's a lot of different companies that are getting into this. Some of the ones that have been around for some time are Emotiv, Neurosky, and then Muse coming into the environment as well. But what ended up happening is that video did very, very well. And I think that it was a testament to how much people were actually looking for this technology online. So it pulled me into learning more about it and becoming more and more interested. I call them personal EEG devices. It's like my keyword in Google that comes up that gets me all my views. So put that up. My disclaimer for this is I don't have any direct financial ties to Muse, and I have a non-monetized YouTube channel called Tech for Psych, but Muse is heavily featured here because they have done such a good job of interfacing with providers. I think as you'll see, they've really got into the niche of meditation and assisting providers in interacting with their clients. And by defining that niche and really building out that infrastructure, I think that it's a very valuable company. Some of these other EEG companies have, dabbled in brain-computer interface where people are trying to program moving robotic arms and wheelchairs and that sort of thing, and that's great. As we'll hear from Dr. Graeme Moffat, who is the head of research at Interaxon, And I might use Interaxon and Muse interchangeably because the company's name is Interaxon, but the device is called Muse. So just stick with me there if I use one of the other names. But it's such a wide space that everybody's kind of defining their own niches, and it's really interesting to see going forward. But again, I feel like Muse has really done a great job in focusing on mindfulness, which I think that's why it resonates so perfectly with what we're learning here at Quantum University in order to introduce mindfulness to our clients. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about why this is exciting. This stuff is so new, guys. Muse Connect just came out like 2 weeks ago. I don't even know of any other conferences that are talking about it right now. We've got Andrew in the back from Muse. I'm not sure where he went, but he has the booth out there. So Muse actually is here, and they have headsets for you guys to try out. We're going to break out into a workshop session in which we play provider and client and sort of develop those skills so you can take that into your practice afterwards. And then at the same time, I'll be talking about research that you can do with Muse. They've built out a good platform for research tools as well so that you can take a look at the raw EEG data and whatever holistic medicine, integrative medicine that you're using, start getting ideas of how you could actually incorporate brainwave data into those findings. So that's the clinical application, and then we'll do the practicum and feedback at the end. So for the first time in history, I feel like we have medical grade EEG at home. And Michael Decaire is a provider in Toronto that recently was featured on the Muse webinar series. And I interviewed him for my YouTube channel because he has done such a great job of incorporating this into his clinical practice and really led the way in showing how this can be done. He has his own practice called Flex Psychology there in Toronto, and he does a lot of talks on mindfulness in Toronto. And he's built out this system that uses things like the birds and the recoveries to build up mindfulness in his clients. And I wanted to play a video from my interview with him just because he explained so well why it's important to get familiar with this technology now going forward as someone that's practicing psychotherapy. So a little bit more background. He originally got associated with Muse when they were in the research stage, sometime around 2013 to 2014. And what they were doing is bringing in meditators and taking a look at their brainwave data and trying to build classifiers through machine learning in order to get the best brainwave system to guide people towards mindfulness from neurofeedback. And he went in there one time, and there was a Buddhist monk that was able just to drop his brainwaves, as Michael would say, to the floor, kind of like probably what Dr. Paul Drouin is able to do with the Muse. So that really got him interested in mindfulness and got him into the field. And then he built up the relationship and kept influencing Muse, saying, this is great for providers, this should really be built out further.
And then when he did his practice, it just dropped. It was like went off a cliff. Like there was just this sudden change in this guy. And the fact that these people can control their minds so instantaneously is something that I want to be able to bring to other people. And I think people need to get on this now, because if they don't, what's going to happen is in 5 years, you're going to have a large group of psychotherapists, regardless of their discipline, who are in tune with that. And everything's going to show those are the people whose clients are getting better. And the people who are not doing that are going to be left to the side. And they're not going to be perceived as efficacious. And so why would you go see that therapist? People are going to start, we're already seeing it. People are coming to me because we're using Muse. And I think people are going to be coming to me because they're going to say, we're coming to this guy because he's getting data on everything. And everything is made as, it includes subjective, but it also includes objective data. And that makes people get better faster.
So he's talking a little bit about, getting associated with this technology and the fact that it really gets people into mindfulness. I like to think of challenges when I'm introducing patients to meditation in my practice is they don't know if they're doing it right. They say they don't have time to do it. And sometimes they get bored during meditation. They just haven't crossed that threshold where meditation really starts to feel good and they get addicted to it, doing it every morning or afternoon or whenever they want to do it. And I feel like something like this does a couple of things with those regards. It improves efficiency a bit because it teaches people whether they're in the zone or not. So it's building that mind-body connection, allowing them to identify between their mind and their body they're in that zone. And it's a training tool in order to get used to meditation. It's advertised as starting out 3 minutes a day, so that solves a little bit of this mental hurdle that people have of getting into meditation. Well, I have 3 minutes a day pretty much for almost anything, so I can sit down and throw the device on and do a little meditation session. And then also it gamifies it. It makes it fun. So you're earning rewards, you're hearing these birds, you kind of like challenging yourself to get into it. And some people even compete against each other. I don't think it's a very Buddhist thing to do, but it's actually something I think is really fun. And what I want to do is some studies at my VA hospital right now, but I think about people that are at sea on ships and how this could help develop mindfulness there. And I know people in the military are really competitive with each other, so I'd like to see them get competitive with mindfulness one day. I wanted to take a step back. You know, I mentioned Lyft and Uber at the beginning of my talk, and it's this idea that entire industries are being disrupted by this technological advancement that we're all experiencing and on this ride together at the current moment. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Gordon Moore. He was an employee at Intel in 1965, and he published a paper called Moore's Law. What he realized is that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit was doubling about every 18 months, and that this was causing an exponential increase in computing power. And what this has done is actually kept pace throughout these decades in most industries. I think that some industries you look at fell off the curve a little bit, but then others are hyper Moore's law, like our iPhones. The iPhones that we have in our pockets now are 120 times more powerful than the original iPhones that came out just within the last 9 years. So it's really increased the computing power. This is one of my favorite authors, Peter Diamandis. He has a really popular TED Talk, and he's written 2 books on the subject. He was a graduate from Harvard Medical School and then started Singularity University and the X Prize Foundation. And in his talk, he likes to talk about this exponential technology concept. And what he'll do is hold up his iPhone and say, this computer that you have in your pocket is 1,000 times more powerful and 1,000,000 times cheaper than the greatest supercomputers of the 1970s. When you think about that, that's just incredible. His first book, Abundance, talked about building up ideas about how to use exponential technology to solve some of the world's greatest problems. And Bold is more tailored towards entrepreneurs that want to make an impact by using this concept of exponential technology. He talks about robotics, he talks about sensors, he talks about healthcare. These are all things that are being revolutionized by this advancement. And when I look at EEG, I see something similar happening. Hans Berger in 1920 originally demonstrated that you could see electrical signals from the brain. And by the 1940s, 1950s, research institutions and major hospitals had these giant EEG machines that would probably take up half a room. And I couldn't even get estimates on how much those things cost, but I think it's fair to say that they're at least over $100,000. And we'll be talking about another system that University of Victoria compared Muse to that cost $77,000. When you look at Stens is a great company. I think they do great bio and neurofeedback training. I know myself and Dr. Paul both have gone to Stens and gotten training there. But these devices like the Nexus 10 cost $5,000, and once you get all the bells and whistles and try to get up to quantitative EEG, you're spending $16,000, $17,000, $18,000 just to get your foot in the door. And then that's added on the cost of hiring potentially assistants to set up the hardware, and not potentially even getting reimbursed for it very well, especially in the United States. And then you take a look at this Muse thing that has come out since 2014, and you say, oh my gosh, $250. What is going on here? Is this a toy? Is this something that I can use in my clinical practice? What's going on here? So, this is me at the Stens biofeedback training, and you bring this up, and there's some people that have been in EEG for a long time that remember the history of these things, and I think that there's skepticism, very warranted skepticism against devices like this. Are they actually picking up good EEG signal? Are the algorithms up to snuff where people are actually getting into a good meditative state? And as I mentioned, you have to get over these hurdles of time, money, and potentially even limited compensation. So I'll get to that in a bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I actually became involved with personal EEG devices. As I said, I do have a YouTube channel on which I look at the interface between technology and the mind. I have a YouTube channel called Tech for Psych. This is some original artwork that I did earlier on. But the progression of this brain scan technology is coming along so quickly. Like, for instance, there's a positron emission tomography helmet that's being developed in West Virginia that we potentially get, that they already have a prototype working that you can get brain scans in a walking patient. So I think what we're going to see is MRI is going to become much smaller and cheaper, and other technologies are going to go that way too. And I think EEG is on this trend, and clients are demanding this. And you look at like a rule of parsimony, 20 to 80 rule, 20% of your activities result in 80% of your results. That has really been the story for me in terms of personal EEG devices on the internet. So there's the demand, there's the niche, and Muse really seems to be getting into this niche. So what's happened in the last 10 years or so? Emotiv was one of the first to really get into the space, and they had a 14-lead EEG channel, and they were really getting more towards, here's a first dry sensor device that you can hook up to your computer for research purposes, and that's great. And Neurosky came out with their original device in 2011, which had one channel, and I actually have one here. I don't know how well everybody can see. I actually have the Neurosky, which I did my original video with. And then I have the Emotiv Insight here too. And when I spoke to Graeme Moffat, who is the head of research at Muse, he originally started doing human EEG in graduate school and then went off to animal physiology. And when he came back to Muse, started working on EEG again. But he was telling me he remembers doing graduate work. And if you look at what EEG normally is, it's having a number of different leads, putting gel on, and then having it on the scalp of your client. And it takes about half an hour to set up. And you're testing bioimpedance, and you're getting the brain waves. And when he originally saw the Neurosky, he said, well, this isn't very much. It's just got this one lead that goes on. It clips onto your ear. How much of this data is actually being useful? But a lot has happened in the last 10 years. As I mentioned, the iPhone has come along to the point where our iPhones are 120 times more powerful than the original ones. And there's been a lot of research done with the actual algorithms that go into making the devices. And I think an important thing to keep in mind with technological progression is something called the Gartner hype cycle. So first, there's an innovation trigger. And I think that happened about 7, 8, 10 years ago with these personal EEG devices, in which the media hypes things up. So you get this Neurosky Mindwave mobile device that comes out, and suddenly people are saying, oh my gosh, we're going to be controlling wheelchairs and robotic arms with our phones in no time with our minds, because the brain-computer interface works. It's going to be a matter of no time before it actually takes off. And that causes something called a peak of inflated expectations. So people get really excited, the thing gets hyped up, and then people actually get their hands on the device, and the natural limitations become more apparent. And then you get something called the trough of delusion. So people get kind of deluded from the technology. But then afterwards, you have this slope of enlightenment, and second and third and fourth generation devices come out, and the technology really reaches maturity, and people are using it the way that it was originally intended to. And in my opinion, I feel like personal EEG devices are coming out of this trough of delusion where you had these initial devices coming out, and people were very skeptical of them, rightfully so. But now we have this technology that's really coming along in second and third generation devices that are picking up quality EEG and can be used for things like mindfulness. And it's kind of funny when you look at this graph. As you can see, virtual reality, they think, is coming out onto the slope of enlightenment. And I wish I could stay here at Quantum University the whole weekend, but I'm actually going to California with Stanford to go to a VR and AR conference tonight, actually. So I'm really excited about that. So these different technologies are coming along. It's kind of funny because I mentioned machine learning, and on this graph, as you notice, it's actually at the peak of inflated expectations right now. So take everything with a grain of salt. But and then also, if you notice, they do talk about brain-computer interface. It's right there. Kind of ironically, as I give this talk, that's not even at the peak of inflated expectations yet. But I think what they're referring to is this idea that one day we'll be able to surf the internet and control things with our minds through brain-computer interface, and we're just not there yet. But again, the continued theme is that I think that these devices have come along far enough to where we can use it very effectively for things like neurofeedback. So what is the effectiveness? As I mentioned before, you take a look at the $250 device and you compare it to something like the ActiChamp, which costs $77,000. So these are a little bit more of the metrics behind this. You can see, the ActiChamp has a higher sampling rate. It's got more EEG channels. But of course, the price is just so far out of the league of the Muse that you really wonder what's going on here. And I think University of Victoria did an excellent study that I'm going to talk about here that just came out in 2017. So what they did was look at evoked related potentials. Now, evoked-related potentials are what your brain does when there's a stimulus. So the idea is that you, for example, put someone in a dark room in front of a computer screen, and first it will show a cross to focus the eyes so that that movement doesn't mess up the EEG signal. And then it'll show either a blue dot or a green dot. Maybe the blue comes along 75% of the time and green comes along 25% of the time. And what it's called is the oddball paradigm. So when the oddball comes up, the brain does this specific reaction, and you test that. Now, there's a lot of noise in EEG signals, so you need to do a lot of different tests in order to improve the signal-to-noise ratio and actually get an ERP. One of the things that I think is cool about the ERP is it's sort of like a canary in the coal mine or a litmus test for the effectiveness of EEG. If you don't have good sensors, if you don't have good software, if you don't have really good EEG equipment, you're not actually going to see the ERP. And what they did was compare Muse to the ActiChamp. And this is on the far left there is the oddball paradigm. You can see the curves are quite similar. I think definitely close enough to be warranted that it is picking up good EEG signal, certainly good enough for neurofeedback. And what the authors mentioned in the paper I think was very powerful because they talked about the difference in testing time. So they tested about 60 students each, and with the ActiChamp, what they had to do was hire 2 lab technicians to put the gel on the channels, put that on the subject, which took about 35 minutes, and then they would do the experiment. And then there was the breakdown phase as well. So for each testing student, it took about an hour to get this oddball paradigm ERP set up, whereas with Muse, you would set it up in 10 minutes. So as you can imagine, you could get a lot more test subjects with something like Muse. And then there's other studies that are going on too. Because Muse has compiled thousands of EEG meditation sessions, there's really interesting research coming out of that. I know McMaster University took a look at that data and was able to show something that people haven't really been able to fully validate before, which is some EEG researchers had shown that something like alpha waves, for example, like a peak alpha wave is different in someone that is elderly, for example, compared to like a teenager. So there's differences in EEG signal, and they were able to look at this big compilation of data and showed that that was true, validate that, and also recognize new things that were going on. So like literally rewriting the EEG textbooks, even on the research side of things, because you can have studies that have such high power. You have a lot of test subjects, and you improve your data through that. This is the oddball paradigm, as I described before. There's a lot of resources. Hopefully you guys were able to look at the Quantum University app, and Muse has these just incredible resources that they've come up with within the last year or so and published those. And you can see the voltage trace comparison between the Muse and the ActiChamp, total power ratios, all this evidence that's showing, hey, I think that this device is good enough for neurofeedback because it's really getting high quality EEG signal. So let's get to bioneurofeedback. What do you use that for? There's a lot of evidence for migraine, ADHD, PTSD. You can use biofeedback for urinary incontinence, anxiety, Raynaud's. I don't think that you have to there's so much evidence out there that it's getting to the point where, especially if we're a Quantum University crowd, I don't have to spend too much time in advocating the use of neurofeedback or biofeedback. I think a good way to think about it is twofold. So triune brain theory was championed by Paul MacLean back in the 1960s, and it might be a little outdated at this point, but I think it's a good starting point in thinking about what we're actually doing here. So in the early stages of evolution, you would have had the brainstem and cerebellum, which are in fish and amphibians, and it's like this really reactionary part of the brain. It takes care of all the autonomic things that are going on that we don't think about day to day, things like breathing, digestion. Something in that area, though, is like the amygdala, where you have this fight or flight response. So you have like this little piece of the brain that is ancient and really running havoc on so many people's lives because you do things like go to war and get hypervigilance because your amygdala is always overactivated and your frontal lobe can't control it. So you have these ancient brain structures that you might not have very much control over that are running people's lives. Later on in the mammalian brain, we developed something called the limbic system, in which you have emotions, memories, and habits. Again, how much control do we usually have over the limbic system if you haven't trained your mind in order to have control over these lower brain structures? And then more recently, we have something called the neocortex, which is very unique to humans in terms of the amount of brain mass that's available for it. And what we're doing for neurofeedback is training that neocortex to have more control over not only these ancient brain structures, but the rest of our bodies as well. This is really manifesting itself in where psychiatry and other behavioral health sciences are headed. We can see different areas of the brain that are communicating with each other, and we can see how well they are communicating with each other. Things like functional MRI, in which you look at the metabolism of different parts of the brain and see how well they're communicating with each other. So psychiatry is headed in this direction of like computational psychiatry, in which we can see, for example, different types of depression. There might be a depression that has more of an anxiety component, in which the frontal lobe isn't controlling the amygdala very well. Or you might have a different type of different type of depression that has an anhedonic component, so people simply can't feel joy. And we're starting to see these differences in actual brain scans. Again, with neurofeedback, we're trying to do something called operant conditioning. So the mind is following the directions from the computer in order to get into a certain mental state. Have you guys seen these multicolored brain images before? It's called a DTI, and it's really cool because the way that MRIs work is they set up a magnetic field through the brain or any other body tissue that you're looking at and sends radio pulses, and then different tissues react to those radio pulses differently. So bone will react differently to lipids, which will react differently to water. And when you have axons that are sending electrical signals throughout the brain, it helps that they're wrapped by something called myelin, which is the fatty tissue that conducts the signal. And we can see myelin, we can see the pathways of myelin. And what's happening is they're mapping out the brain in something called the connectome. So what you see here is all these different colored lines are axon paths of myelin. And the different colors represent the orientation. So maybe green is going front to back, blue is going top to bottom, etc. If you think about what that is, the brain is this complex mass of circuits. And the frequency that these circuits are firing are representing thought, movement, all these different things. And it's really come to the point where we're trying to make an alphabet of the brain. And I think that is what EEG shows. EEG is a composite of electrical frequencies that are happening throughout the brain and reflecting different mental states that we are in. And by knowing what different electrical frequencies correspond to the different mental states that we're in, we can teach computers to teach us to get into certain mental states through something called operant conditioning. One of my favorite authors, Graeme Moffat, he's a researcher at New York University in New York City, wrote a book called Rhythms of the Brain, and it really shaped my understanding of what is actually going on in the brain. So I mentioned these different frequencies that are going on. So you have the axons that are sending electrical signals. And thinking back to maybe like high school or college physics, if you have two different waves that are firing at the same time, you'll get a higher amplitude, which is why people with seizures have like these really high amplitude EEG signals. Whereas if you get firing out of phase, it decreases the amplitude. So basically what's going on in the brain is there's all these different firing mechanisms happening in all these different circuits that are communicating with each other. And the way that these resonance patterns come together correlate and encode basically the subjective experience. This is a lot of what Graeme Moffat talks about in Rhythms of the Brain. Very highly published neuroscientist in New York City. So basically what happens is as these different circuits are communicating with each other, it causes voltage changes in the brain. And the main one that EEG tends to pick up is called a local field potential. So there are columns of pyramidal cells in the top of the neocortex. And when they fire, they cause these changes in voltage that are beneath the skull. And you're putting the leads on top of the skull, and they're sensing that voltage change. So that's really what's creating the EEG signal. So how do these devices actually work? Well, when you look at the Muse, it's kind of like a circuit. You got these sensors on the front here, as you guys will see in the workshop portion. And it's got three reference channels and 2 active channels that are corresponding to right here on the brain. There's a classification system called the 1020 system that Muse follows, and you have 2 frontal polar leads, and then actually the rubber on the back is conductive. So you're getting signals from the back of the brain in something called the temporal parietal. And as those local field potentials are happening in your brain, the electromagnetic signal is propagating through the tissue. And what it's doing is affecting electrons that are actually within the device itself. So there's something called an analog signal. And it's affecting the electrons that are in the circuit. So what that needs to happen is it needs to be amplified through an amplifier that's actually in the device. And then that analog signal is converted to digital, and then it goes through a mathematical analysis. This is the setup for the Muse in terms of the 1020 international system. So as I mentioned, you have a couple of reference electrodes and the different channels that are on the Muse. And this is just a diagram of a circuit. So if you know the current that's going through a circuit and you know the resistance, you can determine the voltage change. And since there's a current that's being created in the device itself, you can determine the voltage change that's happening in those local areas of the brain. This is actually the chip that's in one of the earpieces. There's a good video online that shows someone taking apart the Muse device. So probably my ugliest slide of this presentation. But this is the fast Fourier transform. This is what Dr. Paul was talking about yesterday with heart rate variability. So you get these complex signals that are coming from these biological mechanisms, and you feed it through these mathematical formulas that are able to break it down into individual frequency patterns. And it's been called the most important mathematical formula that we've had in the past century. So for a long time, what we've been doing is taking these complex waveforms and breaking them down into frequency patterns, and that's how EEG has been interpreted. So for example, you take this complex waveform and you're breaking it down into how much each frequency is contributing to the overall signal. So what you get is different ratios. You might have a different ratio of beta to alpha. You might have a different ratio of delta to gamma. And depending on these ratios, you can determine what state of mind that the subject is in. So I think it's important to become familiar with the different frequency bands for research purposes at this point. But as I'll talk about in a little bit, EEG research has really gone beyond just these frequency bands, because now we have programs, whether you want to call it artificial intelligence or machine learning, that are picking apart these waveforms in very complex ways. They are designating different parameters, primary, secondary, tertiary parameters, and using complex mathematical analysis to determine how each one of these waveforms really corresponds to mental states. But I'll go through it, because if you guys are interested in doing research with Muse Direct and Muse Lab, what you're going to find is that it's going to break these signals that you're getting in individual frequency bands. And if you do look at the ratios of the frequency bands, you might be able to get some good objective data in what you're doing in your practice. So delta waves are the slowest band, usually from 0.5 to 3 hertz. And typically you see this in sleep or coma, or for example, traumatic brain injury, you'll have a high ratio of delta waves. It's kind of interesting and morbid at the same time. If you're like cut a section of the brain out of someone and put it into Petri dish, apparently it would go at delta frequency. So it's kind of like it's kind of a baseline frequency. Someone told me that once. And then theta is like this transitionary state. So if I like to think about getting out of bed in the morning and being drowsy and just kind of out of it. So there's probably a lot of high theta in that point. And there's a lot of folklore when it comes to theta. People say that it allows the brain to be in a very creative state. So sometimes people reward alpha to theta ratio for meditation. Alpha is the one that has been historically really looked at for meditation. It's this state of mind in which you're in a calm, focused state. And for a long time, people that were doing neurofeedback rewarded high alpha, and they still do. Later, it became more ratio of alpha to theta, and more recently, more complex waveforms. Beta, 13 to 30 hertz, typically associated with high concentration. So if you're reading or being really logical, you're going to see a lot more beta waves in the frontal lobe especially. And gamma waves are these really high frequency waves that are happening all throughout the brain, typically looked at much more in terms of for neuroscience research. But the way that Gheorghe Bushaki, the individual that I mentioned before, talks about brainwave frequencies is really interesting, because what you have is this complex organ that has 100 billion neurons that are all firing at different frequencies and somehow communicating with each other. And typically in isolated parts of the brain, they're firing very quickly. So you get these really minute calculations that are happening throughout the brain, but they need to communicate with each other somehow. So they're communicating with each other through these circuits through slower oscillation wave frequencies. So an example I like to think about is, if I look out in this room, first my brain is picking up there's a pattern here, okay? And that might be communicated in a lot of really quick gamma oscillations all throughout the brain. But it needs to integrate that signal and create a subjective experience. So maybe those gamma waves are coming together in different oscillative frequencies and creating slower waves that represent things like, oh, there's a lot of people in this room. And then higher cognitive order structures would, recruit memories from the hippocampus and other understandings of my relationship with these people. So higher frequency waves and lower amplitude coming together and creating these slower oscillations that encode a lot more of an understanding of our subjective experience. And this is Graeme Moffat. He's the head of research at Interaxon. I think his official title is VP of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs. And he was so interesting to talk to. I interviewed him for my YouTube channel. And we talked about the limitations of technology related to EEG devices. And I talked about this a little bit before, sort of the progression between the original Neurosky devices that were coming out and now what we see with Muse, Emotiv, and a couple of the other companies that are really taking things to the next level. And he did talk about the actual space, and he also spoke about machine learning. So I thought I would show that video for you guys too.
Is pretty good. Advanced brain monitoring is pretty good. Neuroelectrics is really good too. And we don't necessarily want to compete in that space. We feel like there's enough potential in the neurotechnology market for everybody to grow in their own ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping you'd be able to tell me a little bit about what the research process looks like when you're designing algorithms for neurofeedback. Are you having subjects sit there and report subjective experience and sort of break down the EEG data that's coming back, or how does that process look?
It's a great question. So when we started out, we were looking at traditional bands in neurofeedback like alpha, beta, theta, delta, and we were trying to pull insights out of those in the way that traditional neurofeedback did it. And there are some powerful insights. You can get very reliable, traditional EEG band information in real time out of Muse. So if you look at the literature on teaching meditation or teaching neurofeedback, there's some powerful numerical and computational techniques for developing a calibration and a classifier on those. So we started from the literature, and then we figured out what it was we wanted to teach, which was, in this case, meditation. So, it's a technology-assisted meditation, really.
Yeah.
And there's a much sparser literature on that. So we started to do some in-house research. We have a couple of meditation teachers on staff. And I myself have some training in cognitive psychology. We have a number of collaborations with cognitive psychologists and researchers in the field. And we started to set up experiments in-house where we would have meditation teachers come in and guide people through a breathing-focused meditation, 10 at a time, collecting data with prototype muses, or in the early days, and now with regular muses. And so we'd be measuring brain states in guided meditations. We recapitulated a lot of the classic experiments like Lost in Thought, where subjects had probes for mind wandering, and we looked when we had enough data. We did this on about 150 people the first time. We went in and did some machine learning on the EEG. So we had labeled data from guided sessions, we had labeled data from mind wandering sessions, and we trained classifiers on that basis. So we do a lot of signal processing and machine learning in the company, and that was how it started. Then when we got the app out and we started our research program, so if you have a Muse app, you'll notice after about the second or third session, it asks you if you want to share your data with the Muse research team to help improve the Muse algorithm and help scientists understand a little bit more about EEG. So when people got involved in the research program, for a while, and to some extent we're still doing this, we were sending them different paradigms and different kinds of algorithms and feedback to try out through the app. And we were getting their feedback on how they worked, whether they liked it or didn't like it, whether they felt it was accurate or more accurate or less accurate. And then we were constantly improving the algorithm on that basis. So one of the things you notice if you look at where EEG signal analysis has gone, especially if you look at the signal processing and machine learning community, is There are definitely some elements of the traditional EEG neurofeedback bands that fall out of machine learning competitions and challenges. But there are a lot of things that are very non-traditional that look nothing like, alpha Z-score neurofeedback. Some really interesting measures that fall out, and so if you open up your data and you look at it in a naive way, in a sense, you try to build an unsupervised classifier for it. Some really interesting things fall out, and you can use those as long as you've got enough good data to build really interesting classifiers and improve the algorithm consistently and generate new insights.
So just taking a look at some screenshots. This is from Nexus. This is what Stens would be putting out. So it's traditional neurofeedback. You would be rewarding higher alpha ranges and rewarding lowering beta. If you had like a patient that had high anxiety, you would be doing that. Some examples of histograms. So when you think about these EEG signals, you can break each bar into each one oscillating per second, and you can see that the different ranges, the different colors represent like alpha or beta or gamma. And basically the state of the art for a long time has been comparing these different ratios in order to define what the EEG signal is actually showing us. And you can do interesting things like that. For example, I'll do this a couple of times in the practicum session, but if you close your eyes, for some reason the occipital lobe goes into alpha frequency, and you can see that with the Muse. I have a video online in which I demonstrated that myself. This is machine learning, just a diagram of what it is. And this is being used by a lot of different industries. They're using it for functional MRI and psychiatry right now because, again, if you feed a bunch of MRIs into a program and say this person had depression with anxiety, this person had depression with anhedonia, it's going to pick apart the different parameters that show. It's going to pick apart the different parameters that were unique to those patients. And basically, what it's doing is building this information data bank to separate out the different brain scans to more accurately be able to diagnose things simply by brain scan. And this is happening in EEG as well, as Graeme mentioned. Now, up until now, we've done a pretty good job of decoding brain signals. You can, for instance, put a direct sensor on the motor strip of someone who's paralyzed and use the different ratios of electrical frequency depending on whether they're imagining moving their arm or not, and get them to move like a robotic arm by using it. The challenge with EEG is that the signal comes up from the brain and then has to travel through different connective tissue in the skull, and then also the cerebral spinal fluid that encases the brain and spreads out a little bit. So it's hard to get a very precise idea of where exactly the EEG signal is coming from. Another thing that Graeme talked about is the EEG market seems to be branching between two different ways. You either have high fidelity or you have high portability. And high fidelity is these 32, 64 channel systems that cost tens of thousands of dollars and have a high sampling rate so that you can do these EEG experiments. But what Muse and some of the other companies have done is more high portability. So you have 4 channels. It's still good enough for neurofeedback, and the sampling rate is high enough for that. But you're not going to be doing the most sophisticated neuroscience experiments for it. And maybe it's not even designed for that. You can do good test studies to where you can parlay that into higher EEG systems if you're associated with a research institution or something like that. But Muse, I think, has really defined this niche of getting people in the door with neurofeedback, and then any providers that actually want to do some research with Muse in order to test out different ideas, they definitely have that software as well. And then locating the different brain waves. So there's something called the inverse problem, where a channel theoretically is picking up all the different communication within the brain. If you imagine like a crowded room, there's a bunch of conversations that are going on, and he had one microphone on the side. Theoretically, it's picking up all the different conversations, but basically what happens is you would have a different microphone on the side of the room, the other side of the room, and it's picking up the different volumes of the different conversations. So that's really what happens with these multiple channels. They're getting this composite brainwave signal, but then breaking it apart through fast Fourier transform, and then be able to localize where exactly the EEG signals are coming from by how loud they actually are. And you can do things like map it to a MRI brain, That's all research that's going on right now. But I'll transition to the more practical parts. You guys ready to get into the practical part of this? I hope you enjoyed the scientific talk, and I felt like I needed to do a good job trying to validate the technology so we all feel comfortable using it with our clients. And it's a good idea to try to understand what the brainwaves actually are and how you get them so that you can more confidently talk about that if people have questions for you. And in the breakout session, what we'll do is role play. So there'll be a provider and a client, and the conversation will go in first talking about what mindfulness is, what neurofeedback is, and how that is used with the Muse, but then maybe even trying to challenge ourselves to explain what exactly the brainwaves are, how the device actually measures those, and further. So this is what the device, the app looks like, and I played it for you guys at the beginning of my talk. There's multiple meditation soundscapes and different links of meditation, and it links to our phones via Bluetooth. Something that Graeme said was actually pretty interesting. It's not actually the computing power of our EEG, it's not actually the computing power of our smartphones that's holding back the EEG analysis to a certain degree right now. It's almost the Bluetooth connection that can't get all of the data on the phone to be even more accurate. So as Bluetooth improves and our smartphones get even more powerful, I think that we're going to see increasing high fidelity in these types of systems. There are multiple meditation libraries, so there's guided meditations. They've got Muse Essentials, there's eMindful Life, and others. Typically, what these programs do is, you can go into the session without getting a talk on mindfulness, but if you're new to mindfulness or your client is new to mindfulness, it might help that after the calibration, they just do a little talk about applying mindfulness to your everyday life and using it throughout the day rather than just during your meditation sessions. And it talks about what meditation actually is. So those programs can be helpful as well. There's other things that we'll be talking about during the research section. There's an app called Muse Monitor that Muse recommended. It was designed by James Clutterbuck. And it's another mobile device that you can actually see the individual EEG signals on and the different frequency bands. On the Muse brain sensing headband, I think that what they did was try to simplify it for people. So what you won't see is the EEG signal broken down into individual frequency bands. What you'll see is what I'll show you in a little bit are these more digestible categories. So what it's doing is using these algorithms that they've designed in order to determine when your brain is active, when your brain is in a neutral state, and when your brain is calm. And calm is that state of mind that you're shooting for to get into the meditative state. So when you're active, your mind is wandering. That's when you hear the waves, the crashing. And when you redirect your attention back to neutral, it chalks up a recovery. So that's a recovery, and that actually comes on the end of the data session. And another metric that's really important are the birds. So if you're in the calm state for 5 seconds straight, you'll start hearing birds. And one way that I've heard them described is that the birds are both a reward and a challenge because they come, you get excited, you're in that meditative state, but then you get excited and then they all flutter off. So basically it's like this additional challenge in getting you to be more mindful and concentrating on the breath. The way that Michael Decaire likes to use this with his patients, and you'll see this in some of the supplementary materials that are on the QU app and then also available through Muse Connect, is that you want to encourage your client to be doing their sessions every day, and it's not necessarily important that they're getting birds all the time. The important part is that they're redirecting their attention back to the breath and getting back to that either not neutral or calm state. Because if you think about it, what that is doing is building these neuronal connections. Through the DTI brain scan that I showed, you saw all those different wire pathways that the brain is actually being made up of. And every time you redirect your attention, you're learning. So you're building those pathways and making those more solid. And what this is doing is teaching people to have an internal locus of control. It's teaching them to be more aware of their mind. It's teaching them to be more aware of their body, giving them space. As a psychiatrist, a lot of my patients, I feel like one of the main problems is they're unable to sort of take a deep breath and relax and be able to make positive changes in their life that's going to allow them to be more effective. And I think that mindfulness is such a powerful tool for that because what it teaches them is that they do have a lot of control over what their mind is doing to a certain extent. Don't get me wrong. If someone has schizophrenia and their mind has gotten to a point where they can't control that anymore on their own. I definitely understand that. But as far as depression, anxiety, a lot of these other ailments that are very pervasive in our society today, I think that so much work can be done in terms of developing mindfulness. And this is why I'm happy to be here at Quantum University, because I think this is a group of people that really understand that and are trying to make big change by introducing that. So this app is really redirecting people's attention back to this calm state and teaching them to have a little bit more control over not only their thoughts, but also where their attention is. So this is actually the worksheet that we'll be looking at during the breakout session. So the way that I wanted to do it is that we'll split the room in half. Okay, one half is going to be doing the role-playing part for about 30 to 45 minutes. One person will play the provider and another person will play the client, and we'll practice explaining what meditation is to the client, explaining how it works with Muse, explore the client's goals with meditation, what are they looking to gain from it, and then we'll practice about explaining how the device actually works, where are the sensors, how does it read the brain waves, how's the data collected and processed to the phone, and how is that data allowing someone to get into a meditative state. Then we'll practice reviewing the patient's meditation score, so you're looking at things like birds and recoveries. And then we'll make recommendations for continued use. There's another document in the QU app and then also on Muse Connect that is a good primer on how to put this out for several weeks. So the idea is that you have a patient come into your office, right? And you're introducing them to mindfulness. So maybe you do a session with them during the actual first time you interact with, or first time you introduce Muse to them. Then I think the ideal is that they're taking a device home. So however people are able to set that up in their practices, the idea is that they're practicing mindfulness at home. So they're either purchase their own device or you're renting them out through your practice, and they're doing homework. And through Muse Connect, you can actually see their data coming back, so you hold them accountable. And that's something that Michael Decaire was talking about. The actual compliance rate for this just skyrockets, because typically you would have a patient that goes home and you ask them in the next session if they meditated or not or practiced their mindfulness exercise, and they either say, oh, I forgot, or maybe they'll say, oh, I did it like 5 minutes before I came into the session. So this is actually showing you when they do the meditation, giving you data and really good talking points to talk about in their next therapy sessions. So as I said, there's a document in there that gives an example of how to do that. Maybe the first week they're doing 3 minutes a day and just getting used to the app, getting used to the idea of mindfulness. And as the birds increase and you get less and less recoveries because they're more in that neutral and calm state, you increase the amount of meditation time. So as you can imagine, the longer that the meditation time is happening, the more opportunities there are for the mind to wander. And that builds up this connection even more. And then you can incorporate that in over the next couple of weeks about discussing mindfulness, what it is, and how it applies to their goals in order to improve their lives. So that document is in there in the QU app and Muse Connect. And then during the breakout session, we actually had our wonderful coaches meditating over the last day and a half. So we'll look at their individual brain wave data. And I definitely saw people that were improving. I think Shelly did a great job. I don't know where she is. There she is. Shelly did such a great job. What Shelly did was automatically, start at 3 minutes, and you could see that her recoveries were pretty high and the birds were low. But then over the sessions, increasing number of birds and less recoveries, and then going up to the next level of challenge at 7 minutes, and again restarting the process. And I think that one thing that might have been discussed yesterday with heart rate variability during Dr. Paul's talk was what is the strategy here? And I think the strategy is really building that connection of the mind to that state. So someone that's unfamiliar with meditation, I think will benefit from this a lot. Their niche is really in the entry level into meditation, and you can use it with higher meditation as well. But I think that's the strength, is really gamifying it, reducing the amount of time it takes to learn to meditate, and then also keeping people from getting bored with it. And what that does is build over time and allows people to be more consistent with it and build the habit of doing it, so that maybe after 8 weeks, they don't need to do Muse every day. They can meditate on their own, but they can always go back to Muse for a refresher. So it's really within that first couple of month period in which you're building the habit that is, I think, the most effective. And I think that a lot of providers that have been paving the way are using that in that way. There's some case studies in there that Michael Decaire did. One of them is pretty striking. It was this young lady that was doing cocaine, marijuana to sleep, and was on stimulants for ADHD medication, and she started doing this, and really what happened was developing the mindfulness helped her back off all these drugs and medications that she was on and be, for the most part, completely sober. And it takes you through that idea of building up the habit of mindfulness from week to week, discussing how that applies to the person's everyday life, and then allowing them to continue the practice afterwards. There's other resources in there. There's some examples on the science behind meditation. So if you're not very familiar and explain what meditation actually does and what it's used for, you can talk about improvements in sleep quality. You can talk about how it improves cognitive function, working memory. Talk about how it has lasting improvements in anxiety and depression, chronic pain, improving reaction to social stress. As Dr. Paul was saying yesterday, there's just droves of data on how effective this type of practice can be for people. And then again, another example on how to introduce Muse, introduce meditation to your patient. This one talks about like meditation is a practice that's been around for thousands of years, traditionally associated with Eastern medicine. It helps you establish an internal locus of control, establishes awareness of thoughts, of emotions, and behaviors, and it has all these benefits to your health, and you should definitely get into it. I won't go through the whole document. But this is what I was talking about before a little bit, gamifying it, tracking it, getting good neurofeedback. Muse in practice. By the way, this is all from the professional. I'm trying to remember the name of that document right now. It's the professional guidebook. So that one is so helpful to read through because it really sets this all up for you and determine like how to describe it to your patient and how to use it going forward. And it also has Michael's case studies in there. This talks about how it actually doesn't use the individual frequency bands as much anymore, and that it's more incorporated into this higher degree of understanding of what the EEG signal actually is. There's a mindfulness worksheet in there. This is the worksheet that had the week-to-week assessments example. Here is a recommendation for using it week to week. So maybe for week 1, you use it 3 to 5 minutes a day, introducing the concept of meditation. Weeks 2 to 4, you're using it 5 to 10 minutes daily, and then during your sessions, you're talking about applying mindfulness to their everyday life. And then as people get better and better at this, what you want to do is increase it to more challenging situations in which they're doing 10 to 20 minutes every day and really further solidifying that meditative practice. This is what the Muse, they didn't call it Muse Connect back then, it was through the Muse professionals, but you could see individual clients that would have progressions over time. This is what it used to look like. And then as we'll see, this is what it looks like now. Might be a little difficult to see, but I'll show you guys during the breakout session, Muse Connect, and we'll take a look at the coach's brain data to do a good practicum there. This is one of the case studies that Michael Decaire helped Muse write up. Muse in practice, so it gives good ideas on how to use it with either depression or anxiety or these different ailments that you're interacting with your clients. And then real quick before we break out, take a break, and then come back for the practicum session, I spoke a little bit about the development. It's called Muse for Developers, and if you go on the Muse website, they have a bunch of different resources there. But either you can use these to develop new programs. I don't know if we have any programmers in here that actually would try to make up new programs, but they do have resources for that, and then they also have the research tools in which you're using different things. There's Muse.io, which is an in-out terminal that takes the data from the device and puts it into Muse Lab. That's actually going to become very quickly a thing of the past. They have a new software program called Muse Direct that is coming out in the next couple of days to streamline that process for researchers. And I was looking, I think I got a screenshot. Okay, I did get a screenshot of this. this is coming out in the next week or two, and what this does is you can have multiple people set up to the devices at the same time and analyze the brainwaves at the same time. So it might be kind of interesting to try to use for whether you're trying to see if people are coherent, if their brainwaves match up or something like that, if they're in the same state of meditation. I mean, use your imagination. It could be pretty interesting to use. And that data feeds into something called Muse Lab. Up here in the upper left is what it looks like. It might be kind of hard with the black there, but as I'll show in the practicum session, you can see all the different data parameters that are coming off the device. And I like looking at it because it's such a simple, readily used device that it's kind of deceptive at some point, you know? And it's kind of cool to see all the different data that the device is actually taking in and using to create this experience that you do when you're in the meditative session. So there's an accelerometer in there. There's all the different frequency bands, whether that be absolute EEG data, whether that be relative EEG data, whether that be calculations of scores of entire sessions. And what you can do is record your meditative session. Muse Lab compiles that, and you can export it to other data. Like you can export it to MATLAB data. So if you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty, you could get a home MATLAB account, which costs like $150, import the data into MATLAB, and then use other programs like EEG Lab to do things like try to map your data to 3D heads or something like that. That was one of my tutorial videos that I put up on YouTube. So kind of a labor-intensive process, you know, recorded a meditation, exported to MATLAB, got that into EEG Lab, and had the program try to map it to 2D and 3D heads. But just kind of an example of all the different resources that are available and the possibilities of what you can actually do with the data if you really want to get into it. So again, just wrapping up, talking about clinical guidance, you know, recoveries are important. The birds show that you're in a calm state. Really what you're trying to do is over time, you'll see the clients reducing recoveries and increasing birds, and that's when you increase the meditative session length, getting them to be regular with it and incorporating that into your practice. So that's pretty much the end of my talk right now. Imagine there's some questions. Can I take some questions right now before we break out in the interactive? Cynthia?
Would you integrate it with like weight loss?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, you know, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think about this habit that people have of going to food when they're stressed out, and that manifesting itself in obesity, diabetes, all that kind of thing. So I think increasing mindfulness would have a good effect on that, at least working with them in a comprehensive plan to go through weight loss. So I could definitely see it applying to that if you wanted to use it in your programs in which people are trying to lose weight. I don't see any problem with that at all.
Yes, thank you very much. Very exciting presentation. And you can feel that we are at the edge now of this first time now, we have a conference about Muse. And you see also what are all the possibility now in the field of practice. You know, when you are certified and you become a neurofeedback practitioner, you can implement this approach in your practice, which is totally, in some way, I would say revolutionary, because, you know, from these high expensive equipment, now you can shift and empower your clientele and plus interact with them with Muse Connect. So very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Welcome.